Look, it's just another weekend we have to get through. We'll endure her lasagna and her stories about the past, and then we'll have a week of freedom. The words didn't come from the phone. They shattered inside me, like an old porcelain teacup I'd cherished for decades. I froze, my hand, insulated in a thick oven mitt, resting on the cold metal handle of the oven door. Inside, the lasagna was waiting not just a meal, but a ritual I was preparing for the Sunday visit from Anna and her family. She, my daughter, must have thought she'd ended the call, but she hadn't. And that mistake cost me more than she could ever imagine. The air in the kitchen was thick with the scent of garlic, basil, and the tomato sauce simmering on the stove. The scent of love, of anticipation, of home, but the word endure, tossed to her husband Tom, transformed that scent into something else, the smell of obligation. Of a prison sentence my own children had to serve in my home before earning their week of freedom. Slowly, very slowly, I removed my hand from the oven. I heard Tom's faint laughter through the receiver, and then a click. The connection was finally, truly severed. I didn't throw the phone. I placed it gently on the countertop, next to a small jar of dried oregano. My movements were mechanical, as if my body was operating on old habit while my soul was trying to gather the shards of that broken porcelain cup. I turned off the burner under the sauce. I twisted the oven dial back to 0. The small green light, indicating it was preheating, went out. Along with it, something inside me went out too. The silence that fell over the kitchen was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the old wall clock, a gift from my late husband on our 20th anniversary. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Each second measured not time, but distance. The distance between a mother preparing a celebration and a daughter for whom that celebration was a burden. I walked into the living room and sat in my favorite armchair by the window. The street outside was alive with its own rhythm. A neighbor walking his dog, children riding bicycles, an ordinary Friday evening. But my world was no longer ordinary. It had become hollow. I sat like that for perhaps half an hour, staring at nothing. Then I stood and returned to the kitchen, but not for the lasagna. I took my favorite small cup, the one I only used when I was alone. I boiled the water and brewed a strong black tea, inhaling its sharp, earthy aroma. I did everything slowly, methodically. It was the first ritual I had created just for myself. Not for them, not for the family. One cup, one person, me. With that warm cup in my hands, I sat back in the armchair, and the memories I had so carefully archived began to surface. I remembered 2015. I was 68 then. My friends, Margaret and Susan and I, had been saving up all year for a dream cruise through the Mediterranean. I can still recall the smell of the glossy page in the travel brochure. It smelled of sun, sea, and freedom. I had already pictured myself on the deck, a glass of wine in hand, gazing at the ancient Greek islands. It cost $4,000, a significant part of my savings. And then Anna called, pregnant with her first child, in tears. "Mom, I'm so scared. The birth is coming. I want you to be here." Her voice was filled with such panic. I remember looking at the brochure in one hand and holding the phone in the other. The sea or my daughter, a dream or a duty. I didn't hesitate for a second. I didn't endure her fear. I absorbed it as my own. The next day I called the travel agency and canceled the trip. The girl on the other end of the line was indifferent when she told me most of the cost was non-refundable, $4,000, and an entire ocean of dreams. I gave them up without regret, because I believed I was investing in something more important in my child's peace of mind, in the foundation of our family. Then all those Sundays flashed before my eyes, 25 years of them, over 1,000 Sundays. Winter, summer, rain, heat. I was at the stove. My hands always smelled of something, onions, dough, roasted meat. I remember teaching little Anna how to make dumplings, her flour-dusted fingers clumsily pinching the dough. I remember her husband, Tom, trying my roast beef for the first time and saying he'd never tasted anything better. I remember my grandchildren growing up at this table, leaving stains from berry juice on the tablecloth. Every wrinkle on my hands is a page in the history of those dinners. I was the librarian of our family chronicles, and in that moment, I realized with a bitter certainty that no one was reading my book anymore. I felt like a page in an old calendar. Important once, but now it was simply time to be turned. The worst part was the word endure. My love, my care, my food, it had all become something to be tolerated. They didn't want to be with me. They wanted to check a box labeled, "Visited Mom." I finished my tea. The cold silence in the house no longer felt oppressive. It had become my ally. I stood up and walked to my husband's study, which I had kept almost untouched since he passed. On a shelf sat a small metal box. I opened it. Inside, in neatly labeled files, were documents. I pulled out the most important one, the deed to this house. The paper was thick, slightly yellowed with age. I ran my finger along the line that read, "Owner." My name was there. Carol Ann McGregor. A single name. Not a family trust, not a deed of gift, just my name. This house, these walls, this garden outside the window, it all belonged to me. Not to the function of mother or grandmother, but to the person. I then took a notepad and pen from the desk. I found the number for the local community center in my address book. I'd known for a while about their Kitchen of Hope program. They prepared hot meals for the homeless and lonely seniors. I carefully wrote down the phone number and their hours of operation on a slip of paper. I put it next to the phone in the kitchen, right beside the jar of oregano, for Monday morning. And then I did one last thing that evening. On the coffee table in the living room, there was always a large, leather-bound photo album, the chronicles of our family. 25 years of photos from Sunday dinners. I picked it up. It felt heavy with memories. I didn't flip through it. I carried it to my bedroom, pulled a large cardboard box from under the bed where I kept old things, and placed the album at the very bottom. I then closed the box and wrote one word on it with a marker: archive. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of filing. As a former librarian, I was simply moving a book that was no longer relevant into storage. That night, I understood that a tradition that brings no joy is not a tradition, but simply a bad habit, and I decided to get rid of my bad habits. I picked up my phone. My fingers no longer trembled. I opened my message thread with Anna, and slowly, deliberately, typed a short message. Plans have changed. Have a good weekend. And I pressed send. Then all those Sundays flashed before my eyes. 25 years of them. Over 1,000 Sundays. Winter, summer, rain, heat. I was at the stove. My hands always smelled of something. Onions, dough, roasted meat. I remember teaching little Anna how to make dumplings, her flour-dusted fingers clumsily pinching the dough. I remember her husband, Tom, trying my roast beef for the first time and saying he'd never tasted anything better. I remember my grandchildren growing up at this table, leaving stains from berry juice on the tablecloth. Every wrinkle on my hands is a page in the history of those dinners. I was the librarian of our family chronicles. And in that moment, I realized with a bitter certainty that no one was reading my book anymore. I felt like a page in an old calendar. Important once, but now it was simply time to be turned. The worst part was the word endure. My love, my care, my food, it had all become something to be tolerated. They didn't want to be with me. They wanted to check a box labeled "Visited Mom." I finished my tea. The cold silence in the house no longer felt oppressive. It had become my ally. I stood up and walked to my husband's study, which I had kept almost untouched since he passed. On a shelf sat a small metal box. I opened it. Inside, in neatly labeled files, were documents. I pulled out the most important one, the deed to this house. The paper was thick, slightly yellowed with age. I ran my finger along the line that read, Owner. My name was there. Carol Ann McGregor. A single name. Not a family trust, not a deed of gift, just my name. This house, these walls, this garden outside the window, it all belonged to me. Not to the function of mother or grandmother, but to the person. I then took a notepad and pen from the desk. I found the number for the local community center in my address book. I'd known for a while about their Kitchen of Hope program. They prepared hot meals for the homeless and lonely seniors. I carefully wrote down the phone number and their hours of operation on a slip of paper. I put it next to the phone in the kitchen, right beside the jar of oregano, for Monday morning. And then I did one last thing that evening. On the coffee table in the living room, there was always a large, leather-bound photo album, the chronicles of our family. 25 years of photos from Sunday dinners. I picked it up. It felt heavy with memories. I didn't flip through it. I carried it to my bedroom, pulled a large cardboard box from under the bed where I kept old things, and placed the album at the very bottom. I then closed the box and wrote one word on it with a marker. Archive. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of filing. As a former librarian, I was simply moving a book that was no longer relevant into storage. That night, I understood that a tradition that brings no joy is not a tradition, but simply a bad habit, and I decided to get rid of my bad habits. I picked up my phone. My fingers no longer trembled. I opened my message thread with Anna, and slowly, deliberately, typed a short message. Plans have changed. Have a good weekend. And I pressed send. When I returned home, the red light on the answering machine was blinking furiously. 1, 2, 3, 4 missed calls. I pressed the play button, and Anna's voice filled the quiet kitchen. It was a performance in 3 acts. Act 1, feigned concern. Mom? Mom, are you there? We've been calling all weekend. We're so worried. Is everything okay? Act 2, guilt induction. We were just talking about your birthday next month. The kids were so excited to... Well, anyway, we're really getting worried now. Act 3, the hook. Please, just call us back so we know you're safe. I listened to the entire message without a single flicker of emotion. She wasn't worried. She was unnerved. The predictable rhythm of her life had been disrupted. She had lost control of a narrative she didn't even realize she was writing, and that was the source of her anxiety. I pressed the delete button. The message vanished. The blinking light went out. Wednesday was for the physical repairs. I'd called a locksmith, a polite young man who arrived on time and worked efficiently. The high-pitched whine of his drill cutting into the old wood of my front door was the sound of fortification. He handed me a set of 2 new gleaming brass keys. All set, ma'am. No one's getting in without one of these. I took them. They felt heavy and real in my palm. The weight of absolute security. The weight of a boundary, clearly and irrevocably drawn. That evening, I undertook the final rituals. I took out the cardboard box marked Archive. I didn't add photos this time. I found Anna's birth certificate, her first report card, a lock of her baby hair. I placed them all into a manila folder and wrote on the tab, History. It was not an act of erasure, but of proper classification. History belongs in an archive, separate from the present. Then I found my old, leather-bound address book. I turned to the M section. McGregor, Anna, and Tom. I took a black fountain pen and drew a single, neat, straight line through their entry. It was not a frantic, angry scribble. It was a deliberate, final edit. Afterward, I sat at my kitchen table, the house quiet and secure around me. On the table was the travel brochure for the Mediterranean cruise I had given up all those years ago. I had picked it up from a travel agency that afternoon. I wasn't ready to book it, not yet. But I smoothed it out and left it there, a quiet promise to myself, my own tradition, waiting to be born. On my way back from the agency, I had walked past a little bakery I hadn't visited in years, a place I used to go with my husband. The smell of cinnamon and baked apples drew me in. Behind the glass counter was a perfect slice of apple pie, its crust golden and sprinkled with sugar. I used to bake pies for them every holiday. It was expected, but this slice was just for me. I bought it, and instead of taking it home, I sat on a bench in the small park across the street. The evening sun was warm on my face. I ate the pie slowly, savoring every bite. For 25 years I had served the feast. Today, I was finally enjoying my own dessert. It was the first dividend from my reclaimed life. It tasted like freedom. It was a Thursday afternoon when the car pulled into my driveway. I was in the living room, reading, a cup of tea cooling on the small table beside me. I didn't need to look up to know it was Anna. I recognized the sound of the engine, the familiar crunch of tires on the gravel. I heard the car door slam, then footsteps on the porch. A pause, the metallic scrape of a key that no longer fit the lock. Then another, more frantic scrape. Silence, a soft knock, then a louder one. "Mom, are you in there? The key isn't working." I turned a page in my book. The house was utterly silent, a perfect vessel for my peace. I could picture her on the other side of the door, her brow furrowed in a mixture of confusion and irritation. Her world, for a moment, had stopped obeying its own rules. "Mom, seriously, open the door. This isn't funny." Her voice was muffled, but the edge of entitlement was sharp. I took a slow sip of my tea. My heart was calm. This wasn't a battle of wills. There was no battle. I had simply left the field. My own mother, a woman of few words but profound wisdom, used to say, "If they won't listen to your words, they will have to listen to your silence." And my silence now was louder than any argument I could ever have made. After a few more minutes of fruitless knocking and a final, exasperated sigh, I heard her footsteps retreat. The car engine started, and she was gone. The quiet returned, deeper and more complete than before. After she left, I put my book down. I didn't feel triumphant, only a quiet, somber clarity. I stood up and began to walk through my house, not as its resident, but as a visitor to a museum of a life I once lived. It was time for a final inventory. I stopped first at my husband's old armchair, the worn leather cracked like a map of the years. I ran my hand over its smooth arm, and a warm memory surfaced, so vivid it was almost tangible. Anna, barely 5 years old, curled up against my side in this very chair, her small body heavy with sleep as I read her a story about a brave little rabbit. I could almost feel the weight of her head on my shoulder, smell the faint scent of strawberry shampoo in her hair. The memory was pure and sweet, a perfect little pearl of love. Then, a colder image imposed itself over it. Anna, just last Christmas, standing by this same chair, not sitting, her face illuminated by the blue glow of her phone as she briskly answered work emails, nodding absently while I tried to tell her about my garden. The chair hadn't changed, but the space between us had become a chasm. I moved to the kitchen and stood before the large oak dining table, its surface covered in a constellation of tiny scratches and dents, each a relic of a family meal. I saw it laden with a Thanksgiving turkey, surrounded by laughing faces. I heard the echo of my husband's booming laugh as he told a well-worn joke. I saw the candlelight glinting in the eyes of my grandchildren as they blew out their birthday candles. It was the heart of our family, the altar of my traditions. But then, the warmth faded, replaced by the chill of more recent memories. The silence of those last Sunday dinners, punctuated only by the clinking of cutlery and the tapping of fingers on screens. The empty chairs when they would cancel at the last minute. The memory of Tom's voice in my ear, saying the word that had changed everything: endure. This table was no longer a place of communion. It had become a stage for a weekly performance of obligation. My walk ended in the living room, in front of the empty space on the bookshelf where the large photo album used to live. For a moment, I remembered the joy of creating it, carefully choosing the best pictures, writing funny captions underneath, hearing Anna's delighted squeal as she found a photo of herself with chocolate all over her face. We were chronicling our happiness together. That warmth was immediately extinguished by the memory of her casual dismissal a few months back. "Mom, this is so sweet, but who looks at printed photos anymore?" The phrase had stung then, but now I understood it. She wasn't just dismissing the photos, she was dismissing the life they represented. A life I had so carefully curated, which had become for her an inconvenient, outdated file. I returned to the kitchen table, but this time I sat down with a purpose. I took out a crisp sheet of paper and a pen. This inventory required a list. At the top, I wrote, "To keep." My cookbooks, all of them. My mother's porcelain teacup. The gardening tools. The old wall clock from the kitchen. I drew a firm line under the last item. Below it, I wrote, "To leave." And then, just one word. Everything else. It was done. The decision was clean, simple, and absolute. The next day, the morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It felt like a day for new beginnings. I brought in a stack of sturdy cardboard boxes from the garage. I began in the kitchen. I didn't pack randomly. I started with what mattered most. I took my cookbooks down from the shelf one by one. They weren't pristine. Their covers were softened with use. Some pages were stained with vanilla extract or a ghost of tomato sauce. Their margins filled with my spidery handwriting: "Add more nutmeg," "Roll thinner," "Tom's favorite." These books were not just recipes. They were my journals, my partners, the silent keepers of my identity. I wiped each one gently with a soft cloth, then wrapped it in tissue paper as if it were a precious artifact. The process was slow, a meditative ritual of honoring my own craft. I placed them carefully into a box, one by one. They were the foundation. They were the tools of my resurrection. When the last cookbook was settled, I sealed the box with packing tape, the screeching sound echoing in the quiet house. I took a black permanent marker. For a moment, I thought of writing "kitchen," but that was a word from the past. This was about the future. I pressed the tip to the cardboard and wrote, in clear, steady letters, "Beginnings." When the box was sealed, I looked around the room. It no longer felt empty or haunted by ghosts of the past. It felt clean. It felt ready. Ready for new stories, ones that would be written without me. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, constructive energy. The act of packing was not an ending, but a beginning. On Friday morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a copy of the local paper, circling apartment listings with a red pen. Not large, empty suburban homes, but small, bright apartments in the heart of the city, with balconies perfect for a pot of geraniums and a short walk to the central library. I made a call, my voice clear and confident as I scheduled a viewing. Yes, a one-bedroom is perfect. All I need is good light. Later, I spent the afternoon in the garden, not weeding this time, but pruning the deadwood from my climbing roses. The snip of the shears was a clean, satisfying sound. I worked methodically, cutting away the brittle, lifeless branches to make way for new, vibrant growth. There was no sense of urgency, no feeling of being watched or awaited. For the first time in years, the time was entirely my own. As I snipped away a particularly tangled branch, my thoughts drifted, unbidden to Anna. The anger was gone, as was the deep, aching grief. In its place was a strange, cool sense of separation, like an archivist examining a historical document. I realized I wasn't mourning the woman who called my home a prison sentence. I was mourning a ghost. The ghost of a little girl with strawberry-scented hair, the ghost of a teenager who confided her dreams in me, the ghost of a young mother who had leaned on me for strength. I missed the idea of her, the version of her that had existed only in my carefully curated memory. The real Anna, the woman who saw my love as an obligation to be endured, was a stranger to me now. And you cannot miss a stranger. That evening, as I was washing my dinner plate, a single fork, the phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, and my first instinct was to ignore it, to let the silence hold its ground. But something made me dry my hands and answer. "Hello?" A hesitant pause. "Grandma?" The voice was young, uncertain. It was Leo, my 17-year-old grandson. "Yes, Leo." "It's me. Mom told me you changed the locks." His voice was small, laced with a confusion that sounded genuine. I was worried." "I'm fine, dear," I said, my tone gentle but not inviting pity. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear him take a breath, mustering his courage. "Grandma, I'm sorry." The words hung in the air. The old me would have rushed in to soothe him, to say, "Oh, it's not your fault, darling, don't you worry." But that woman was gone, archived in a cardboard box. I stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch, forcing him to own the weight of his words. "Thank you for saying that, Leo." I finally replied, my voice calm and measured. "Tell me, what is it, specifically, that you are sorry for?" The question was not an attack. It was a scalpel, intended to cut through the vague, inherited guilt and find something real. He stammered, I don't know, for how things are, for Mom being so upset." "I see," I said, the coolness in my voice deliberate. "So you are sorry for your mother's feelings. Is there anything else?" The silence on his end was profound. I could almost hear the gears turning in his young mind, replaying the last few months, the last few years. When he finally spoke again, his voice was different, thinner, more honest. "I'm sorry," he said, the words barely a whisper. "I'm sorry for being quiet in the car when they would talk about having to get through Sunday dinner. I'm sorry for laughing when Dad made that joke about your stories. I'm sorry I never once said thank you for the meal. Not really." A crack. A small hairline crack in the wall of their collective denial. "Thank you, Leo," I said, and this time there was a sliver of warmth. "That is something I can accept." "Can I see you?" he asked, the question rushing out in a torrent of hope. "Please?" I considered it. This was the test. Not for him, but for me. "Yes," I said, "but on my terms. You can come tomorrow afternoon at 3:00, and you will come alone." The next day, the doorbell rang at precisely 3. I opened it to find Leo standing on the porch, his hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets, his gaze fixed on his shoes. He looked so much younger than I remembered. I led him into the living room, which was now dotted with sealed cardboard boxes. The air smelled of paper and finality. I hadn't baked. I offered him a simple cup of tea and a plain digestive biscuit from a store-bought packet. We sat in silence for a moment, the steady tick-tock of the old wall clock the only sound between us. "This is weird," he finally said, looking at the boxes. "It's a change," I corrected gently. He finally met my eyes, and I saw the genuine conflict there. "Why didn't you just tell us you were upset? Would it have mattered?" I asked, a genuine question. "Or would it have just been another one of Grandma's stories you had to endure?" He flinched, the truth of it landing like a stone. I went along," he confessed, looking down at his teacup. "It was easier. Mom and Dad, they get into a rhythm. It's easier not to fight it." I nodded, not in judgment, but in understanding. "You wanted to belong to their world," I said softly. "That's a powerful need in a family. Sometimes it makes us quiet when we should be loud, and loud when we should be listening. You're not a bad person, Leo. You just chose the path of least resistance. Most people do." My words weren't meant to absolve him, but to name the thing he had done, to give him the vocabulary for his own weakness. He looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Can it be like it was before?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Can I come back?" This was the moment, the request to rewind, to erase, to pretend. And my answer had to be the foundation of everything to come. "No," I said, my voice kind but utterly firm. "It can never be like it was before. That house is closed." I saw the hope drain from his face, and I continued, "But you are welcome to visit me in my new one. Not for Sunday lasagna, not for a tradition you have to endure. You are welcome to come for a real conversation, for honesty. You are welcome to come and simply be with me. If that is something you truly want." He stared at me, slowly understanding. This wasn't a punishment. It was a new contract, an upgrade. As he was leaving, I wrapped 2 of the plain biscuits in a napkin and handed them to him. "For the road," I said. It wasn't a peace offering. It was just a small kindness, the first transaction in a new, and hopefully more honest, economy of love. After he left, I stood at the window and watched his car disappear down the street. The sky, which had been gray and overcast all day, was beginning to clear in the west. Perhaps some doors aren't meant to be slammed shut and barricaded. Perhaps they are meant to be quietly, firmly locked from the inside, so that you are the only one who holds the key. And perhaps, if you are very wise, you leave a small window ajar, just a crack, for the ones who learn to knock gently and have the courage to come alone. The following Monday was a day of clean, decisive action. It was the day I signed the lease. I chose my outfit with the care of a general preparing for a treaty signing, a simple navy blue dress, my sensible leather shoes, and the string of pearls my husband had given me on our 30th anniversary. They felt cool against my skin, small orbs of quiet confidence. The real estate agent's office was modern and minimalist, smelling of fresh coffee and the faint, clean scent of glass cleaner. It was a world away from the dust and ghosts of my old house. The agent, a woman named Sarah with a warm, efficient smile, laid the documents on the polished glass table. The papers were crisp, the text dense and black. I read through them, not with anxiety, but with the focused attention of a librarian cataloging a new acquisition. Sarah pointed to the final page. "Just sign here, and the place is yours." I picked up the heavy fountain pen she offered. Its nib scratched softly against the paper, a sound of permanence. Carol Ann McGregor. My name, my decision, my future. When it was done, she slid a single, shiny key across the table. I picked it up. It was lighter than my old set of house keys, unburdened by attachments to a past that no longer served me. The apartment I had chosen was on the 4th floor of a handsome brick building downtown. When I'd viewed it, the first thing I noticed was the light. It poured in through a large bay window, illuminating the entire space, making the newly polished hardwood floors gleam. There was no musty smell of old memories, only the clean, promising scent of fresh paint. From the window, I could see the tops of trees in a small city park and hear the distant, reassuring hum of life, a sound of connection, not isolation. I knew the moment I stepped inside. This was it. This was a place to live, not to wait. After signing, I didn't linger. I walked out into the bright afternoon sun, the single key clutched in my hand, a small, cold piece of my new sovereignty. That afternoon, I was carefully wrapping the old wall clock from the kitchen in a thick blanket. Its familiar tick-tock had been the heartbeat of my home for 40 years. My husband, Robert, had bought it for me at an antique shop, his eyes sparkling as he told me, "So you'll never forget it's time for a cup of tea." As I secured the last corner of the blanket, a car I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. It was Tom, my son-in-law, alone. He walked to the door and knocked, a hesitant, uncertain sound. I stood in the hallway, the wrapped clock in my arms, and did not move. "Carol, I know you're in there. Leo said he saw you. Can we please just talk?" His voice was strained, the voice of a man who had lost his script. "There is nothing to talk about, Tom," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the solid wood of the door. "I don't understand what we did that was so awful," he pleaded, a note of pathetic frustration in his voice. It was not a question seeking an answer, but a statement demanding I absolve him. "That, Tom, is the problem," I replied, my voice as calm and steady as the clock's ticking. "You don't understand, and it is no longer my job to teach you. This is tearing Anna apart. It's tearing this family apart," he said, his final desperate gambit. "Guilt. The family was a beautiful vase with a crack in it," I said, the words coming to me with absolute clarity. "For years, I held it together with my bare hands, hoping no one would notice, but it was already broken. All I've done is let go, so I could finally wash my hands of the shards." I heard him sigh, a sound of utter defeat. He stood there for another minute before I heard his footsteps retreat down the path. After his car drove away, I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door, and then the tears came. Not tears of sadness for him or even for Anna. They were tears of pure, unadulterated release, a dam of unshed grief from 1,000 tiny cuts over 25 years had finally broken. My shoulders shook with the force of it. It was a raw, physical purging of every ignored birthday, every canceled plan, every dismissive word, every moment I had felt like a function instead of a person. It lasted for perhaps 7 minutes. When it was over, I felt utterly, completely empty. And then I felt light. 2 days later, Margaret and Susan came for tea, my 2 oldest friends, my fellow would-be cruisers. They sat in my living room amidst the boxes, unbothered by the chaos. The air smelled of Earl Grey tea and the lemon cake Margaret had brought. The warmth between us was a palpable thing, a comfort built not on obligation, but on shared history and genuine affection. Susan was telling a hilarious story about trying to teach her husband how to use a smartphone. He held it to his ear and shouted, "Operator!" I swear, Carol, the man is a fossil. We laughed until our sides ached, the sound echoing joyfully in the half-empty room. It was so easy, so real. In the middle of our laughter, I took a sip of tea and said, "I'm moving." They stopped, their cups hovering mid-air. They looked at each other, then at me. There was no shock, no pity. There was only a slow, dawning understanding. Well, Margaret said, placing her cup down with a decisive click, it's about damn time. Susan reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Where to, adventurer? She asked, her eyes shining. In their reaction, I saw the reflection of my new family, one built on choice, not blood. A family that celebrated my freedom instead of mourning their loss of control. Anna came on Saturday. She didn't knock. She used her old key, and when it failed, she banged on the door with the flat of her hand, a percussive, demanding rhythm. I opened it. She stood on the porch, her face a mask of cold fury, her designer handbag clutched like a weapon. She didn't wait for an invitation, pushing past me into the hall, her eyes widening at the sight of the boxes. What is this? She demanded. What have you done? I am packing, I said simply, closing the door behind her. How could you do this to us? To your family? She began, her voice rising. The first manipulation, an appeal to an institution she herself had desecrated. I am not doing this to you, Anna. I am doing this for me, I replied, my voice unnervingly calm. You saw this family as a duty. I have simply decided to relieve you of it. The children are devastated. You're punishing your own grandchildren because you're having some sort of episode. The second manipulation, using her children as shields. I am teaching my grandchildren a valuable lesson, I said, looking her directly in the eye. That love is not a resource to be endlessly withdrawn without a single deposit, that a person's time and heart have value. It is a lesson, I'm afraid, that you never learned. She recoiled as if struck. After everything I've done for you, the calls, the visits, the third manipulation. Rewriting history, painting herself as the dutiful daughter. Let us be very clear, I said, my voice dropping, becoming as sharp and precise as a surgeon's blade. You did not visit me. You made an appearance. You did not want to be with your mother. You wanted to check a box in your planner that said visited mom. You were not coming to see a person. You were coming to inspect your inheritance. The truth of it hit her, a visible shock that made her stagger back a step. You saw this house not as a home, but as an asset, I continued, pressing the advantage. And you saw me as its inconvenient, temporary caretaker, waiting for me to fade away so you and Tom could cash in. Her face contorted with rage. You will die alone in this house, she spat, a final, venomous curse. A small, sad smile touched my lips. No, Anna, I won't. You see, I won't be dying in this house at all. I'm moving next month. I let that sink in. Her fury dissolved into pure, slack-jawed disbelief. And as for this house, this asset, I walked to the mahogany desk, picked up a single, crisp document, and handed it to her. It was a copy of my newly executed last will and testament. I've made other arrangements. The house and the bulk of my estate have been used to establish the Robert and Carol McGregor Foundation for Community Libraries. My legacy will be books, Anna. Not ungrateful children. She stared at the paper, her face paling. The words charitable trust and final bequest seemed to leap off the page and strike her dumb. It was checkmate. She looked up at me, her eyes hollow, stripped of all their power and entitlement. She was no longer a daughter confronting her mother. She was a failed investor looking at a catastrophic loss. She turned, wordless, and walked out the door she had stormed through only minutes before. I watched her go, her shoulders slumped in utter defeat. I closed the door behind her. It didn't slam. It clicked shut, a sound as quiet and final as a period at the end of a very long sentence. I did not feel joy. I did not feel sadness. I felt only the profound, resonant silence of a space that was, for the first time, entirely my own. This was not the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of sovereignty. The final pieces of my old life fell away, not with a crash, but with a series of quiet, satisfying clicks. The first came on a Tuesday morning. A call from Mr. Davies, my lawyer. His voice was warm and professional, but beneath it, I could hear a note of genuine admiration. "It's all done, Carol," he said. "The foundation is officially established. The title for the house has been transferred, and the new will is ironclad. From a legal standpoint, you are now the sole and absolute architect of every inch of your life." The words hung in the air, beautiful in their simplicity. The sole architect. I thanked him, my voice steady. After we hung up, I walked to the post office. The clerk handed me a small bronze key to my new P.O. box. It was a simple, practical step, but it felt monumental. It was the last lock, the final door between the demands of my past and the sovereignty of my future. No more unwanted letters, no more circulars addressed to a family that no longer existed in that form, just a small, secure box waiting for correspondence I had chosen to receive. The following Saturday, Leo came to the old house one last time. He found me in the garden, packing the last of my prized rose bushes into burlap sacks for transplanting. The atmosphere between us was different. The awkward tension had been replaced by a quiet, gentle ease. We didn't talk much. He helped me lift the heavy root balls, his young strength a silent offering of support. Afterward, we sat on the porch steps, sharing a thermos of tea and the last of the store-bought biscuits. The house behind us was a hollow shell, echoing with the ghosts of what had been, but out here, in the sun, it was just the two of us. "Mom's not taking it well?" he said, staring into his cup. "Dad says you've lost your mind, that you're being selfish." I took a slow sip of tea before answering, letting the warmth spread through me. "No, Leo, I'm not being selfish. I'm just no longer willing to be a resource. Your parents aren't mourning me, the person. They are mourning the loss of a version of me that existed to serve their needs. They miss the function, not the feeling." He nodded, understanding far more than a boy his age should have to. Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, framed object. It was a drawing he had made, a pen and ink sketch. It depicted an old, magnificent oak tree, its roots deep and strong, standing alone on a hill, its branches reaching defiantly toward the sky. It wasn't a sad or lonely tree. It was powerful, self-sufficient. "I made this for you," he said quietly, "for your new place. So you remember." I took it from him, my fingers tracing the strong, confident lines. He hadn't drawn a weeping willow, bent by the winds of duty. He had drawn an oak. He saw me not as broken, but as rooted. "Thank you," I whispered, my throat tight with a new kind of emotion. Not grief, but a fierce, protective love. It will have the place of honor on my new wall. The day of the move was bright and clear, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. I woke before dawn in the empty house. The silence was absolute. I walked through the rooms one last time, my footsteps echoing on the bare wood floors. I ran my hand along the sun-faded patch on the wall where the old clock had hung for 40 years. I stood in the doorway of Anna's childhood bedroom, remembering not the anger of our last encounter, but the sleepy 5-year-old I used to tuck into bed. I felt a pang, not of regret, but of a sweet, distant sorrow for a story that had simply reached its end. There was no bitterness left, only gratitude for the good parts and a quiet acceptance of the bad. On the polished surface of the mantelpiece, where the family photos used to stand, I left a single key to the old front door. Beside it, I placed a small, simple note. It read, "Thank you for the shelter. May you find your own peace within these walls." I walked out the front door and, without a single backward glance, closed it softly behind me. Arriving at the new building felt like docking in a safe harbor. The movers were efficient and respectful. The building manager greeted me with a small potted orchid as a welcome gift. The apartment smelled of fresh paint and possibility. Sunlight streamed through the large bay window, making the empty rooms feel bright and spacious rather than barren. The first box the movers brought in was the one I had marked Beginnings. I opened it myself. The first thing I unpacked was my electric kettle. I plugged it in and set a pot of water to boil, the simple, domestic sound, a comforting anchor in the newness of it all. The second item I unwrapped was Leo's drawing of the oak tree. I leaned it against the wall in the living room, right where the morning sun would hit it. It was the first piece of art, the cornerstone of my new life. The last thing I took from that box was my mother's porcelain teacup, the one that had survived the initial shattering of my old world. I washed it carefully in the new stainless steel sink and made myself the first cup of tea in my new home. It tasted of peace. My new routine settled into a gentle, unhurried rhythm. In the mornings, I would read the paper by the bay window, the city waking up below me. A few days after I moved in, I found an old letter from Robert tucked inside a cookbook. It was from a time he'd been away on business, dated 30 years prior. I had forgotten it existed. His familiar, sloping handwriting filled the page. He wrote about missing my baking. "It's not just the bread, Carol," the letter read. "It's that you pour your own strength into it. You've always been the strongest person I know. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." Tears welled in my eyes, but they were tears of affirmation. He had seen me, truly seen me, all those years ago. His words were a blessing from the past, a validation of the path I had chosen. One afternoon, I decided to bake. Not an elaborate lasagna or a complicated cake for a crowd, but a simple loaf of sourdough bread, just for me. I mixed the dough with my hands, feeling the familiar, comforting resistance. The kneading was a meditation, a slow, rhythmic process of turning simple ingredients into sustenance. As the bread baked, a warm, wholesome scent filled my small apartment, a fragrance not of obligation, but of self-care. While it was cooling on the rack, Leo stopped by. It was his third visit, and it already felt like a cherished ritual. He was helping me assemble a small bookshelf. There was no agenda, no forced conversation. We talked about his plans for college, about a bike he was trying to fix. The conversation was easy, flowing around the simple, shared task. He tightened the final screw and wiped his hands. "It's peaceful here," he said, looking around the small, sunlit room. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of fresh bread. "Is this what peace is?" I smiled and sliced a thick, warm piece of the bread, handing it to him on a plate. "No, my dear," I said, watching the butter melt into the crust. "This isn't all of it, but it's a very good piece of it. Yes." That evening, after he left, I sat in my armchair by the window, Leo's drawing of the oak tree illuminated by the soft light of a table lamp. I wasn't mourning a house. I wasn't mourning the silence from Anna or the angry justifications from Tom. I wasn't mourning the old version of myself, the one who whispered, "Maybe next time they'll see you." Because I saw myself now, and I no longer needed anyone else's permission to exist. There is a point in a difficult convalescence when the body, having spent all its energy mending shattered bones and knitting torn flesh, finally finds the strength for a deeper, quieter task, dissolving the scars from the inside out. It is a slow, cellular alchemy, turning rigid, hardened tissue back into something supple and alive. My soul, I believe, had reached that stage. The sharp, Jagged wounds of betrayal had healed over, leaving behind not ugly keloids of resentment, but fine, silver lines of wisdom. The house, my former shell, my gilded cage, was the last great scar, and it was time for it to dissolve. The call came from Mr. Davies on a rainy Tuesday. "The sale is final, Carol." The funds have been transferred to the Foundation's trust. I was sitting by my window, watching the rain streak down the glass, a cup of tea warming my hands. I felt no jolt of loss, no nostalgic pang, no triumphant glee. I felt only a quiet, profound rightness, as if a great weight I hadn't even realized I was still carrying had finally been set down. "Thank you, Arthur," I said. "Thank you for everything." That afternoon, I put on my raincoat and walked the 6 blocks to the downtown women's shelter, the beneficiary of the newly formed McGregor Foundation. The director, a woman named Maria, with tired, kind eyes, greeted me in a small, cluttered office that smelled of coffee and quiet desperation. I handed her the portfolio containing the final documentation and the initial transfer confirmation. She looked at the sum on the paper, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Mrs. McGregor, I don't know what to say. This will change everything for us." "I hope so," I said, my voice soft but firm. I looked past her, through the open office door, and saw a young woman in the hallway, holding a small child's hand, her face a mask of weary resolve. "This is for the women who have to leave in the middle of the night," I said, my gaze meeting Maria's. "It's for the ones who have to choose between a roof and their soul. It is to buy them shoes for the long walk ahead. I had shed all my tears for that house already. This was not an act of grief. It was an act of intention." A few days later, Leo visited. He arrived, looking more subdued than usual, carrying a beat-up cardboard box that looked strangely heavy. "Can I keep this here?" he asked, not quite meeting my eye. "Just for a while." I didn't ask what was inside. I didn't need to. I saw in his posture the familiar weight of a child trying to carve out a small, safe space for his own identity within a home that demanded conformity. It was a box of treasures, books his parents disapproved of, a sketchbook, perhaps a diary, a portable sanctuary. "Of course," I said, pointing to a space in my hall closet. "This is a safe harbor, Leo. You can anchor here any time." We sat by the window, sharing a simple lunch of tomato soup and toast. "They don't understand," he said quietly, stirring his soup. "They think you've become hard. They keep asking if you can ever change back." I looked out at the rain, which had softened to a gentle drizzle. "That's the wrong question," I said. A better question would be, can they stop pretending that their needs are the center of the universe, pretending that love is something you are owed, rather than something you earn and nurture. People can change, Leo, but they have to be willing to look at the truth of who they are first. And that is the most terrifying thing in the world for most. He nodded, a sad wisdom in his young eyes. When he left, I knew the small space in my closet now held more than just a box. It held the fragile seed of his own eventual freedom. Our bond was no longer a remnant of a broken family. It was a new structure, built on honesty and mutual respect. The letter from Anna arrived a week later. It was handwritten on expensive stationery, her elegant script looking strangely frantic. It was a torrent of confusion, regret, and thinly veiled demands for an explanation. "I don't understand how we got here," she wrote. "I lie awake at night replaying every conversation. I am so lost. Please, just tell me what I need to do." I read the letter twice, slowly. There was no anger in me. There was not even pity. There was only a vast, quiet distance. The woman who had written this letter was a stranger searching for a map to a country that no longer existed. I folded the letter neatly, opened the bottom drawer of my writing desk, and placed it inside. I did not throw it away. Her pain was real, and it deserved a space to exist, but it did not deserve a space in my present. I closed the drawer. My 75th birthday arrived, not with a flurry of anxious preparations, but with the gentle morning light slanting across my floor. There were no false, cheerful phone calls, no forced celebrations to be endured. I woke up, made myself a small stack of buttermilk pancakes, and enjoyed them with a perfect cup of coffee while reading a novel. It was a quiet, perfect celebration of self. Just after noon, Leo arrived. He presented me with a handmade card. On the front was another drawing, this time of a single, sturdy key. Inside, he had written, "For the woman who taught me that you can build a new home by first learning to lock your own door. Happy birthday, Grandma. It was the most precious gift I had ever received." We spent the afternoon talking about his future, his excitement palpable. He told me he'd decided to volunteer at the library, inspired by the foundation. "You look different, Grandma," he said as he was leaving, a thoughtful frown on his face. You seem like a person who doesn't flinch anymore." In the evenings that followed, my new life unfolded in a series of quiet, beautiful vignettes. My potted orchid, the one from the building manager, which had looked so frail upon arrival, began to sprout a new, vibrant green leaf, a small, persistent symbol of resilience. Margaret and Susan would come over for weekly Scrabble games, our laughter filling the small apartment, the air thick with the comfortable scent of friendship and wine. One evening, my phone buzzed with a text message. "Happy birthday, Mom." It was from Anna. I read the words, took a slow breath, and placed the phone face down on the table, silencing it. It was not an act of anger. It was an act of peace, my peace. That night, before I went to sleep, I sat at my small desk and opened a new journal. The first page was blank, a clean slate. I thought back to the beginning of it all, the casual, brutal words that had shattered my world. "We'll endure her lasagna and her stories." They had wanted to turn my love into an obligation, my life into a story that was finished. They had wanted me to fade into the background of their busy lives. Now, I finally had the answer. On the first clean page of my new journal, I wrote the last words of my old story and the first of my new one. They once saw my life as a thing to be endured, but I chose to live it instead. I learned that a home is not a house you own, but a space where you are seen. I learned that a family is not defined by blood, but by who shows up with clean hands and an honest heart. And I learned that the most important tradition of all is to wake up each morning, look in the mirror, and remember your own name.